a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings.
I think a new world order is emerging.
An inside job? How dare you? How dare you?
To create, so to say, mass-produced models of human beings arranged in some kind of a scientific caste system.
We shall go on to the end. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall never surrender.
Yes, I'm online. I think I'm on. Yeah, it's on. Good day, everybody. It's the 25th of April, 2015. Good morning, Anon. 81, I think it's an 8170. How you doing? So, let's see, we can welcome people in the chat. Dell's been there for like 6 hours. Jane, also for almost 2 hours. Jules just popped in on the second account. Populupa has been here for like same amount as I am, which is just like 14 minutes. Vince has been hanging out for hours already, and a couple of anons. Welcome, everybody. So, at the top of the chat page, where you can get to via ucy.tv, the way that I know, there might be more, but is that you go to shows, click on any of them, and there you will find a link to the chat. It says, among other things, refrain from attacking other chatters. Alright, that would be called ad hominem. Is that you attack the person instead of the arguments. So don't confuse those two. If you're talking in the chat, you're making some argument and somebody else is attacking your argument, don't identify with it. Alright, there's a difference between the argument somebody is making and the person. Sometimes people, they get quite angry when their thought patterns are attacked. And, you shouldn't do that. It's just thought patterns, right? Okay. That's about enough for the chat. Today we will continue with Larkin Roses, the most dangerous superstition. Diving right back into where we left off. Last time, it goes, it is true that the degree of evil and the types of immoral aggression advocated vary based upon the different styles of statism. Constitutionalists, for example, advocate relatively low levels of robbery and extortion, aka taxation, and advocate that only certain limited activities and behaviors should be controlled via threats and coercion, aka regulation. But every power which any constitution pretends to grant to any legislature is a power not possessed by mere mortals or individuals. Yeah, that's a contradiction right there in itself, right? The whole idea of government is fictional. It's people that actually do things. The government itself does not act. Because it cannot act. It is nothing. It's not there. You can't point to a single thing and say, well, that's government, right? It doesn't exist in that sense. It's only people that do things. And so how can it be that these people somehow have more, quote-unquote, rights than you and me do? That's just insane. Who would bother, continuing, who would bother writing into a constitution a line pretending to delegate to certain people a right already possessed by everyone else? Right? All such grants of power and any document purporting to create a government or empower any legislature to do anything are attempts to issue a license to commit evil. However, as should be patently self-evident, no person or group of people, regardless of what documents they create or rituals they perform, can grant to someone else moral permission to commit evil. And putting supposed limits on such permissions does not make it any more sane or legitimate. In short, to advocate government is always to advocate evil. Hold on, let me fix some windows here. There we go. Liberals and conservatives both insist that someone needs to be in charge, because that is the reality they were raised in. Yes. I remember that as a child, I was asking about certain things, about our society, how it works and stuff. And I was like, how could these people let this happen? Already then I was like, this is strange, this doesn't make sense. The only thing required of them was that they remain obedient to authority. From that training, from that training, they have little or no idea what to do if left to their own devices, if no one is telling them what to do. So they refuse to grow up and try to hallucinate into existence a superhuman authority. Yes, the word hallucinate here is very correctly used. Paradoxically, even though there is no earthly species above human beings, they seek to fabricate this superhuman entity out of nothing but human beings, and then try to bestow upon it superhuman qualities, rights, and virtues. Hold on, guys. I'm sorry, I'll be right back. Sorry about that. I might need to go AFK a few more times during the broadcast. Check on my cat. He's still not doing very well. He's still alive, but that's about all I can say about him for now. The entire concept is delusional, but it is shared by the vast majority of people the world over, who refuse to accept the fact that there is no shortcut to determining right and wrong. Yeah, so what can I say about that as a philosopher, right? This is interesting. As I said last week, I've been doing a little bit of study in the field of philosophy, which I wasn't supposed to do, according to a friend of mine. But there were a couple of good things, though. One of them is the way in which most, if not all, philosophers work, right? The system that they use, I guess you could call it. I gave you 5 of them last week. First 2 are, in my opinion, most important. The The first one is metaphysics, also known as ontology, which deals with the nature of reality. Answers the question, what is reality? I may have used a different word last week, I'm not sure. The second one is how do you know what you know, which is epistemology, right? So but if you put those two together, you get an ethics. Ethics is what is wrong, what is right. So depending on what you think the universe is made of, or what is reality, and how do you know things, that's a question where you first need to answer what is knowledge. You need to have a definition of that, and certain philosophers use different working definitions, as I call them. Right, there are philosophers out there that would have this axiom, like Plato, for instance, that there is this non-material reality out there, in his case, world of forms. Yes and no, epistemology, not epistemony, something like that. Epistemology. Look it up. And so if you have a different view of what knowledge is, you have a different view of what reality is. And depending on those views, what follows is an ethics. That's the third one. All right? So first, ontology or metaphysics. The second is epistemology. And from that, based on the axioms and conclusions that you draw from the axioms, there flows out a ethics, right? So that's why the first two, is in my opinion anyway, are the most important, because from ethics follows politics also. Hold on. Yeah. So, there you go. You know, like Plato, like I said, he has some non-material reality out there, and he says, well, knowledge is about that. That's that which you cannot perceive with your senses, right? That is a bit like the opposite of what Aristotle was promoting. He said that, well, knowledge is based on sensory perception, and you might draw via deduction conclusions that make concepts that cannot be grasped by your senses, right? And so from the concepts come the knowledge, right? So that's a totally different approach than Plato had. I tend to agree with Aristotle that on the basis for knowledge should be your senses, and depending on how you interpret that which you get through your senses, you create a worldview, right? That's your ontology. That's your metaphysics. All right. Enough of that. Where were we? And there is no shortcut to determining right and wrong, that there is no magic trick which will make truth and justice automatically prevail. some subjectivists might disagree with that, which is totally insane. They think that by thinking something you can manifest it into existence. By thinking something you can make it real. Right? That's the prevailing philosophy out there today, which is just insane. No matter what you think, reality is what it is, regardless of how you feel about it or what you think about it. Your thinking does not have an effect on what is, right? It's Kant. He totally screwed it up. He's like, well, maybe reality should conform to what we think. That's his way of thinking. No, it's the other way around. Your way of thinking should conform with reality. Then maybe one day you can dare call yourself awake. That there is no system that can guarantee safety or fairness, and that everyday mortal human beings, with all of their deficiencies and shortcomings, are the best and only hope for civilization. There is no tooth fairy or Santa Claus or magical entity called government which can make an immoral species behave morally. Yeah. So moral comes from ethics again. Or make a group of imperfect people function perfectly. And the belief in such an entity, rather than being merely pointless and ineffective, drastically increases the overall stupidity, conflict, injustice, intolerance, violence, oppression, and murder in human society. And the belief... I just did that. I'm sorry, I'm keeping an eye on the chat also. If you guys have any questions, see if you can type that in like capital letters, so it'll more stand out to me. If you have any questions, I'll try and answer them. Doesn't have to be on topic, as far as I'm concerned. Nonetheless, most of those indoctrinated into the worship of government would rather cling to their familiar, horrible, destructive, heinously evil, profoundly anti-human superstitions than grow up and accept the fact that there is no one above them, that there is no giant mommy or daddy to save the day, that they are at the top, and that each of them is personally responsible for deciding what he should do and then do it. Right? In other words, what he's saying is you are personally responsible for creating your own ontology, your own epistemology, and draw from that your own morals, your own ethics. In other words, he's saying everybody should be a philosopher. And as far as I can see it, most people are. But they're unconsciously doing it. Sadly, they would rather suffer the hell of perpetual war and total enslavement than face the uncertainty and responsibility that comes with freedom. The belief in authority negates and overrides nearly all of the positive effects of religious and moral beliefs. What most people call their religion is empty window dressing. Yes, I would call it hollow as well. And what most people tout as their moral virtue is irrelevant as long as they believe in the myth of authority. Right? You're gonna have to use a lot of doublethink if you are like religious and claim to be moral, right? And still accept government as an authority, right? The two just don't jive. Christians, for example, are taught things such as, if someone strikes you, turn the other cheek. love your neighbor, and even love your enemy, and do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Yet every so-called Christian who believes in government constantly forsakes these principles, advocating constant aggression against everyone. Friend and enemy, neighbor and stranger, via the cult of government. To put on a show of being pious, religious, compassionate, loving and virtuous while voting for a gang that promises to use violence to control the actions of everyone you know is the height of hypocrisy. Yes, I would call it doublethink. To refrain from personally robbing one's neighbor while pushing for someone else to do it is both cowardly and hypocritical. Right? I didn't come up, by the way, with that term doublethink. Right? If you want to know more about that, just type it into Google and see what you get. Yet almost every Christian and every member of every other religion does such things on a regular basis by way of political advocacy. Alright, time to light the cigarette. As mentioned before, faith in government is a purely religious belief. As such, the vast majority of those who wear the label atheist are not actually atheists, because they believe in the God called government. They do not recognize it as a religious belief, of course, but their belief in that ethereal superhuman savior of mankind, authority, is as deep and faith-based as any other religious belief. Ironically, atheists are often quick to point out the destruction that has been committed throughout history in the name of religion, but fail to notice the gruesome results of the God they bow to, government. The atheists are absolutely right to point out that when churches were the accepted authority, the organizations thought to have the right to forcibly control others, many of them committed large-scale heinous acts of terrorism, torture and murder. But what most modern atheists fail to realize, despite the clear evidence staring them in the face, is that they are the members of the most destructive church in history, the Church of Government, which has managed to wreak havoc, death and destruction on a level far beyond what even the most vicious churches in the past did. Alon says, Walter, is doublespeak the type of language the Pharisees used? I don't think so. I'm not very well versed in the type of... they are Old Testament based, right? The Pharisees. Eye for an eye and that kind of thing. What I remember is that it had more to do with like how to serve God, right? So I would say no. Doublethink means that you hold two contradictory ideas at the same time. And you can flip from one to another. When you flip from one to another, you quote-unquote forget the contradiction that you hold in your head. Alright, so doublespeak is thinking or speaking in contradictory terms, which is happening a lot, I might add. Alright, continuing. For example, over the span of 200 years, around 1 or 2 million people were killed in the religious wars known as the Crusades. In comparison, in half that amount of time in the 20th century, over 100 times as many people were killed by the progressive policies of collectivist government. All right. Oh, blah, blah. Let's see. Yes, here we got it. Advances in technology no doubt played a large role in the increase in deaths, but the point is, whether the mask of authority is worn by a church or state, the superstition is horribly dangerous, and the results horribly destructive. You're welcome, Anon. The fact that so many atheists eagerly condemn one form of the superstition while vehemently advocating it in another form shows an amazing degree of selective blindness. Right? That could also be seen as doublethink. Right? You could call it selective blindness. You see religion as an authority creating all kinds of havoc, but then when it comes to government, you don't think like that. Right? That's also kind of doublethink. Or, as Larkin puts it, selective blindness. Often those most critical of oppression via religion are some of the most devout true believers in the God called government. Again, in the eyes of those who believe in government, there is a world of difference between acceptable individual behavior and acceptable government behavior. When an individual steals $100, it is seen as an immoral crime. When those in government steal trillions of dollars every year, it is seen as acceptable. If the average individual prints his own $100 bill and goes out and spends it, that is seen as fraud and counterfeiting, an immoral act akin to theft. When government gives legal permission for the Federal Reserve to do the same thing, but with trillions of fiat out of thin air dollars, that is seen as acceptable, even useful and necessary, while various... there should be a dot there. Even useful and necessary. While various governments have declared that the average man is not allowed to possess firearms, various governments like those in the Netherlands, for instance, the mercenaries of governments are allowed to have gun bombs, fighter jets, tanks, missiles, even nuclear warheads. Ironically, such weapons, with the exception of nuclear weapons, are routinely put into the hands of the very same people who, before they became mercenaries for the state, were prohibited from possessing firearms. In other words, when those individuals use their own judgment, some politicians declare them to be too untrustworthy and too much of a danger to society to be trusted with a 5-shot revolver. But when those same people are blindly following orders, obeying the chain of command, those same politicians declare that they can be trusted to have assault rifles, sniper rifles, grenades, mounted machine guns, tanks, fighter jets, bombers, heavy artillery, and countless other tools of large-scale destruction. In addition to the huge chasm between what the masses perceive to be acceptable individual behavior and acceptable government behavior, the public sense of when government has gone too far seems almost random. The standard by which average individuals are judged are simple and constant. If they steal, defraud, assault or murder, that is bad. But the measure of right and wrong for government seems largely arbitrary. For example, it is now widely accepted that outlawing alcohol would be unjustified, but outlawing marijuana and using widespread constant violence to enforce that prohibition is legitimate. As an even more bizarre contradiction, most people would be rightfully offended if government attempted to coerce everyone into picking up litter in their own neighborhood. But most accept it as legitimate when government, via the military draft, coerces people into going to another country to either kill people or die. Bizarrely, this most heinous example of forced labor, forcing people to go to halfway around the world to murder complete strangers, was even committed by a government whose own rules, in the 13th Amendment, prohibit involuntary servitude. Yeah. Isn't that a kind of... it's kind of strange, right? Involuntary servitude. As if voluntary servitude is good. You know, it doesn't make sense to me. I would say that even voluntary servitude is a bad thing because apparently you have been indoctrinated into thinking that servitude is a good thing. Right? It is clear that the limits of what government is allowed to do as far as the general public is concerned are not based on any particular whatsoever. Any principle whatsoever. One reason people throughout the world and throughout history have been so slow to resist tyranny is that, as long as the growth of tyranny is slow and steady, the tyrants are never seen as having crossed the line. This is because, without any underlying principles by which to gauge right and wrong, there can be no line to cross. The belief in authority is completely incompatible with any moral principles, precisely because the essence of belief is the idea that those in authority are not bound by the same rules of conduct as their subjects. Logically, how could the subjects ever feel justified in dictating standards of behavior to their masters? And if taxation increases from 62 to 63%, how could any statist on principle declare that any line has been crossed or that government has overstepped its bounds? There can be no principal objection to robbery unless it is an objection against any level of robbery, even if quote-unquote legal. If 1% forced confiscation of wealth by government is legitimate in principle, then so is 99%. Either the rulers own the people and have the right to take as much as they please, or the people own themselves, and the rulers have no right to forcibly take anything from them. When the violence of government becomes too widespread, too arbitrary, and too vicious, statists very slowly begin to question it. But there are no real principles guiding how they judge the righteousness of the actions of the ruling class. Once it is accepted that one group of people has the inherent right to commit acts of aggression against others, there is no objective standard for limiting such a right. If government can require people to have a license to drive to the street, to the COMER store. What is that? COMER. Is that a typo? Let's try this again. If government can require people to have a license to drive to the store, why can it not require people to have a license to walk down the street? If it is legitimate for lawmakers to demand that private firearms be registered and regulated, why is it not also legitimate for them to demand that all forms of speech and expression be registered and regulated? If it is okay for politicians to create an enforced government monopoly on delivering letters, as the US Postal Service has, why is it not okay for them to create an enforced government monopoly on telephone services? The reason government is always a slippery slope, constantly pushing away from freedom and towards totalitarianism, is that once someone accepts the premise of a ruling class, there is no objective basis whatsoever for applying any limits to the powers of that ruling class. Yeah. Legal positivism, the positivist philosophy, right? Whatever the prince says goes, right? William Roberts. If you can catch some of his older works, go listen to him. He's very wise. Or I should say was. There can be no rational moral standard for saying that a certain person has the right to commit acts of aggression, theft, intimidation, assault and coercion, but that he may commit such acts only to a certain degree or only if, quote-unquote, necessary. For slaves to concede that they are the rightful property of someone else, only to then claim that there are limits on what their owners may do to them, is a logical contradiction. Yeah, that's correct. For a subject to accept any master, including the one called government, and then imagine that he, the subject, will decide the extent of the master's power, defies logic and reality. Yet that is what all believers in representative government seek to do. Yes, it's another form of doublethink. In short, those who believe in authority have accepted on the most fundamental level that they are owned by someone else, the people claiming to be the authority. Having accepted that idea, they then proceed to beg the masters for favors. In doing so, however, the people are continually reinforcing the idea that ultimately it is up to the masters what will be done with the subjects. The one constant message that echoes throughout the entire political process is this: here are things that we, the people, ask that you, the rulers, allow us to do. The implicit message underlying all political action is that the only power the people have is the power to whine and beg, and that ultimately it is always up to the masters what will happen. To push for any change in the law is to accept the law as legitimate. Alright. Hold on, guys, I'll be right back. Alright, it seems to be doing okay. In contrast, if an armed driver was accosted by a carjacker with a knife, the driver would feel no need to lobby the aggressor to beg him to give his permission for the driver to keep his own car. If the driver had the means to forcibly repel the attacker, he would have every right to do so. To ask for something is to accept that the decision is the other person's to make. To ask those in government for a bit more freedom is to admit that it is up to them whether the people may be free or not. In other words, to ask for freedom is not to be free, but to accept one's subjugation to someone else. Consider what an oxymoron it is for a person to claim to have an unalienable, or is it inalienable, right to do something. Right? I've translated this word into Dutch just to get a better understanding of what that is supposed to be. Right? The word alien in Dutch, you get vreemd, which would be translated back to strange. Right? So that doesn't make sense, right? Not in the way this term is meant. What is meant by vreemd means, if you put the in front of it, you get ontvreemd. Well, that means stealing, right? So this is talking about something that cannot be taken away from you. That's what it means. right? Consider what an oxymoron it is for a person to claim to have an unalienable, I can't pronounce that word, right, to do something and then to ask the politicians for the legislative permission to do that thing. The belief in authority ultimately leads even those who imagine themselves to be ardent pro-freedom advocates to condone their own subjugation. No matter how loudly it makes no matter how loudly they demand that politicians change some law, those who claim to love freedom while still suffering from the authority superstition merely reinforce the legitimacy of the ruling class's control over them by implicitly agreeing that the people need the ruling class's legislative permission in order to have the right to do anything. All right, we're up to the next heading. The effects of the myth on freedom advocates. Here, this is now he's telling you what I told you like 20-30 minutes ago. Government itself does no harm because it is a fictional entity. But the belief in government, the notion that some people actually have the moral right to rule over others, has caused immeasurable pain and suffering. Yeah. By the way, the notion that some people actually have the moral right to rule over others, that is pure Plato. Alright? Because he believed that only those that have knowledge of the non-material are able to be members of a ruling class, right? It's just insane. Has caused immeasurable pain and suffering, injustice and oppression, enslavement and death. The fundamental problem does not reside in any set of buildings or any group of politicians or any gang of soldiers or enforcers. The fundamental problem is not an organization that can be voted out or overthrown or reformed. The fundamental problem is the belief itself. The delusion, superstition and myth of authority which resides in the minds of several billion human beings, including those who have suffered the most because of that belief. Ironically, the belief in authority dramatically affects the perception and actions even of those who are actively fighting against a particular regime. Right? 2 words that spring out to me are perception and actions, right? It says here, ironically, the belief in authority dramatically affects the perception and actions, right? Perception, that's what you do with your senses. Then based on how you interpret what your senses perceive, you create a piece of the puzzle which is called reality. Based on that, you commit actions. Right? So I'm not completely in agreement here with the word perception. Alright? Because I think there's nothing wrong with your senses. It's how you interpret what you, for instance, hear or see. Right? If you walk in a desert and you're thirsty, and you just walking across trying to find some oasis or whatever, and in the distance you see a lake, and then you move over there and there was no lake. Right? You all know what you saw, right? Fata Morgana. The point is, your senses didn't deceive you. It was your interpretation of what you saw that was deceptful. Right? Same thing goes for hearing. If you can hear politicians speak, for instance, you should listen very carefully and interpret their words as they mean them to be heard. And then you go and see, well, he can only mean good things with this. Well, he's lying, right? But sometimes they speak very plainly. They're pretty blunt about it sometimes. Right? So, there's nothing wrong with your senses. It's your interpretations of those inputs that create a false worldview on which you base your actions. Okay, alright, continuing. Ironically, the belief in authority dramatically affects the perception and actions even of those who are actively fighting against a particular regime. The superstition drastically alters and limits the way in which dissenters fight oppression, and renders nearly all of their efforts impotent. Impotent. Furthermore, on the rare occasion that a particular tyrant is toppled, one form of oppression is almost always replaced by another, often one that is even worse than the prior one. Instead of fighting against a non-existent beast, what freedom fighters need to do is to recognize that it is not real, that it does not exist, that it cannot exist, and then act accordingly. Of course, if only a few people overcome the superstition, they will likely be ridiculed, condemned, attacked, imprisoned, or murdered by those who are still firm believers in the myth. But when even a significant minority of people outgrow the superstition and change their behavior accordingly, the world will drastically change. When the people actually want true freedom, they will achieve it without the need for any election or revolution. Alright. The trouble is, let me see, let me read that again. Yeah, it's okay. The trouble is, almost no one actually wants humanity to be free, and almost no one opposes oppression in principle. To wit, the effects of the myth of authority remain intact even in the minds of most people who consider themselves to be rebels, non-conformists, and freethinkers. Yeah. In Dutch we have that too, free thinkers. You can hear the etymological tie when I translate that into Dutch. You get vrijdenkers, free thinkers, vrijdenkers. They are pretty rigid in their thinking, I can tell you, especially here in the Netherlands. They're not free at all. They simply have a different way of thinking about things, but they're still very stuck in what I would call illusion. During their teenage years, many people go through a period of apparent rebelliousness, which consists mostly of doing whatever those in authority tell them not to do. Engage in smoking, sexual promiscuity, drug use, wearing different clothes or hairstyles, getting tattoos or body piercings, and so on. As such, their actions are still controlled, albeit in a backward way, by the myth of authority. Instead of obeying for the sake of obeying, they disobey for the sake of disobeying, but still show no sign of being able to think for themselves. They behave like angry children instead of complacent children, but still do not behave like adults. And in most cases, their natural desire to break the chains of authority does not last long. They outgrow their anti-authoritarian tendencies and gradually transform to back into model citizens, also known as obedient subjects. Yes, Dan puts it in the chat. Free thinkers, vrij denkers. Free is vrij. You hear the etymological tie there, right? V-R-I-J. I-J is like one sound. And then thinkers becomes dinkers, becomes denkers, which is Dutch. Denkers. To think, denk. For example, the supposedly radical anti-authoritarian hippies of the 60s more or less became the new government in the United States with the presidency of Bill Clinton. Oh, really? Eek! Even the peaceniks, whose mantra was live and let live, were given the opportunity to become the new authority, chose to forcibly meddle with the lives of others as much as or more than their predecessors did, including via military conquest. Likewise, those in Generation X, the MTV crowd, and so on, have always focused their efforts on putting people who agree with them into power, instead of working to actually achieve freedom. There is a fundamental difference between having complaints about a particular ruling class and recognizing and opposing the insanity of authority in principle. In short, in all the various societal manifestations of so-called rebelliousness and nonconformity, almost none have actually escaped the myth of authority. Gedanken, anon, yes. There seems to be an etymological tie there between thinking and thanking. The words sound so much alike. However, I cannot see what the two have in common. To think is not to thank, right? The two different words, right? The only thing that I could possibly tie it to is a religious notion that to speak is to thank. That's the only religious, going back thousands of years, you would pray to God, right? Which would be thanking God in lots of ways. Yes, Dutch is easy if you speak German, same for the other way around. If you speak Dutch, German also becomes more easy. Someone says Dutch is easy if you speak English. No, I don't think so. It's probably easier the other way around. Especially because Dutch is kind of illogical in some ways when making sentences. It's much more straightforward than English. I rather speak English than Dutch, by the way. Yeah. Alright, where were we? Instead, they have merely attempted to make a new authority, a new ruling class, a new government, a new centralized machine of coercion through which they could forcibly subjugate and control their neighbors. In short, nearly all so-called rebels are phonies who pretend to be resisting the man, but who really just want to be the man. Yeah. and this should be expected. If one starts with the assumption that there should and must be an authority, and that the government exerting control over a population is a legitimate situation, why would anyone not want to be the one in charge? Each person, by definition, wants the world to be the way he thinks it should be. And what better way could any person accomplish that than by becoming king? If someone accepts the notion that authoritarian power is valid, why would he not want it to be used to create the world as he wants it to be? This is why the only people who truly advocate freedom in principle are anarchists and voluntarists. People who understand that forcibly dominating others is not legitimate, even when it is called law, and even when it is done in the name of the people or the common good. Yeah. What springs to my mind here when he uses the word law is the Hammurabian text. Hammurabi, right? You will find that a lot of laws today are based in those ancient words, Hammurabi text. And some of the things in the Hammurabi text are insane, I would say ruthless, barbaric, right? One of the other things that I read about it kind of sounded okay to me, and that was, if you accuse someone of murder and it turns out he's innocent, you get to be murdered, right? That ought to stop you from accusing somebody of murder without sufficient evidence, right? Kind of harsh, right? But it sounded okay at the time. Yeah. All right. There were also other things about land use and stuff like that. You would get punished if you were owner of a land but did not use it to create food or use it properly. So who then owns the land, right? That would be Hammurabi, right? The guy who wrote the text. There is a big difference between striving for a new, wiser, nobler... By the way, that shows you how long we've been under this myth of authoritarianism, right? Thousands and thousands of years ago, we were dealing with law. There is a big difference between striving for a new, wiser, nobler master and striving for a world of equals, where there are no masters and no slaves. Likewise, there is a big difference between a slave who believes in the principle of freedom and a slave whose ultimate goal is to become the new master. And this is true, even if that slave truly intends to be a kind and generous master. Even those who advocate a relatively benign type of government are advocating against freedom. As long as the people believe in the myth of authority, every downfall of one tyrant will be followed by the creation and growth of a new tyrant. History is replete with examples such as Fidel Castro and Guevara, something like that, who portrayed themselves as freedom fighters, just long enough to become new oppressors. They were no doubt quite genuine in their vehement opposition to the oppressions which they and their friends suffered from, but they were not opposed to authoritarian oppression in principle, as clearly demonstrated by their behavior once they obtained power themselves. This pattern has been repeated over and over again throughout history, with the resentment of one tyrannical regime becoming the seed of the next tyrannical regime. Even Hitler's rise to power was due in large part to anger at the perceived injustices and oppressions inflicted upon Germany via the Treaties of Versailles. And that is correct. And they knew that long before they even came up with this Treaty of Versailles. Right? So don't forget that. This is called culture creation. Culture management. Of course, as long as the rebels suffer from the superstition of authority, their first priority, once they have overthrown one government, will be to set up a new one. So even acts of great bravery and heroism among those who still believe in government have accomplished little more than replacing one tyrant with another. Many have been able to recognize and oppose specific acts of tyranny by specific regimes, but very few have recognized that the underlying problem is not who sits on the throne, the problem is that there is a throne to sit on. The same failure to recognize the real problem occurs in more mundane, relative peaceful reform as well. In the United States, for example, a large portion of the population is perfectly able to see the injustices resulting from the war on drugs, global warmongering and other violations of civil rights committed by Republican tyrants. No. I don't think that the Democrats are any better, by the way. However, not recognizing the belief in authority as the real problem, the solution proposed by those who recognize such injustice is to give the reins of government to Democrat tyrants instead. Yeah. Meanwhile, another large portion of the population is perfectly able to see the injustice resulting from heavy taxation, government micromanaging of industry, wealth redistribution schemes, citizen disarmament, etc. But, not recognizing the belief in authority as the real problem, the solution proposed by those who recognize such injustices is to give the reins of government back to Republican tyrants. And so, decade after decade, the machine of oppression changes hands, while individual freedom in all aspects of life continues to dwindle. And still, all that most Americans can ever contemplate as a solution is yet another election. Right? You should put an S before that word, election, in brackets. Or another political party, or another lobbying effort, in the hope of begging the ruling class to be more wise or benevolent. Right. It's been a while. Now click, move it. It's time for a break, guys. We need to find a nice piece of music. And I can't find it really that fast. So let's put this like this. Let's see what we get. No, we don't want Lady Gaga. Freedom Palooza 3, we already did that. Blah, blah, blah. More Lady Gaga crap. Maybe this is something? No. Let's see if we get, let's Google and see what, maybe Pokerface has something on their website we are allowed to play. Pokerface.com. Music. No, we can only buy, and I recommend you guys buy, but blah, blah, blah. You guys have some samples. YouTube. Poker Face. Oh, this is also nice, right? Let's see what we got here. Yes, this is 5 minutes. And we're gonna play this. It's not music, but that doesn't matter. It's more political stuff. Yeah. I don't believe in politicians at all. You guys know that, right? And the one you're going to hear is Ron Paul, and I have nothing against him. No, that's not the point. But the thing is that I think it's a steam valve for people to say, well, we want these and these kinds of changes, so we are for Ron Paul, right? Not to mention his son, right? And I think it's like a steam valve, like, oh, we'll put Ron Paul out there, so we have one quote-unquote puppet for these kind of people also, all right? So this is promoted by Pokerface via their website, pokerface.com. Here we go.
Intruding on the whole Persian Gulf if the United States, as you asked for in the debate last week, left the region. Do you fear that?
Well, I fear that they might want to do that, but I think our policy is leading to that. Everything that we do enhances the Ahmadinejad crowd in Iran. There's a dissenting force in Iran, and everything we do to undermine that government, we have our own CIA over there now trying to undermine that government. In doing that, we bring all their people together, so the ones who want to dissent and oppose him are, they lose their power to do so. So I would say our policy is doing everything conceivable to enhance Iran. Just the whole invasion of Iraq has helped Iran.
Well, that may or may not be true.
They're the one.
It
well,
may or may not be true. I mean, it's a
debate.
debatable issue. I'm not going to say it isn't true, but it's a debatable issue. But look, as we saw in the summer war last year, Iran can arm and finance a force like Hezbollah and cause a lot of trouble. And the United States doesn't have anything to do with that at all. So I think that in our national security situation, we have to assume that Iran is an aggressive nation, that it wants to injure the United States, and is going to use surrogates to do it. Now, if you have an Iran actively seeking nuclear weaponry, as you do, and if you have the ability of that country to hand it off to a Hezbollah or an Al-Qaeda or anybody else, you withdraw from the region, you give them carte blanche to do what they want. Do you not, Congressman?
See, I think you're concerned about the wrong country right now, because more than half of the Al-Qaeda that are committing suicide in Iraq right now are Saudis, and nobody even talks about that.
I'm concerned about all the things. But when they're seeking a nuclear weapon, when a country's seeking a nuclear weapon that's a danger to the USA, a stated danger, and you want to withdraw from the theater, that gives them carte blanche to do what they want, does it not?
Well, first off, you have Pakistan, and they're not exactly the most pro-Western
but I'm talking about
country.
Iran, Congressman. I'm not talking about Pakistan at this point.
Why don't you ever let me, answer the question?
Because you're not directly answering the question, sir.
Because no, I do not fear them as you do, as many do, because they want another war. They want to spread this war. This has been the plan by the neoconservatives to have this major overall. This revamping of the whole Middle East, precisely the reason the Al-Qaeda is growing. The Al-Qaeda is growing because of our policy. Our national security is threatened because of our policy, and it makes it much worse. So I see the Iranians as acting logically and defensively. We've been fighting the Iranians since 1953. We overthrew their government through the CIA in 1953. We were allies with Saddam Hussein in the 1980s, and we encouraged him to invade.
All right, so I did want to get that. We don't need a history lesson, but I do want to get this on the record.
You have to understand.
I do understand the region, man, but we don't have time to do the history lesson tonight. I just want to get this on the record. You don't fear Iran, even though Iran has demonstrated it can start a war, which it did last summer with its Hezbollah surrogates, and it's stated that it wants to do damage to Israel, wipe it off the face of the earth,
Okay.
and is developing a nuclear weapon. And you don't fear them?
Yes, I worry about it. I'm concerned about it. But what I'm saying is the very policy that you advocate is encouraging that. What I'm saying, Bill, is this. That put it in perspective. They don't have a weapon. They're not likely to get one in 10 years, according to our CIA.
That's not true. That's not true. I mean, everybody says it's 5 years or less, and without us in the theater, it's going to happen a lot quicker.
How come we got through the Cold War when the Soviets had 40,000 of them?
Because it was mutual destruction. It was mutual destruction. Now you can hand off any weaponry or any kind of thing to surrogates who will do your killing for you. You look, if you don't think Iran is sponsoring terrorism, you're living in a land of Oz, Congressman.
Well, so Saudi Arabia. What are you going to do with Saudi? What are you going to do with Pakistan?
It's not a government policy of Saudi Arabia. It's just their failure to do any effective policing. It's policy in Iran to wipe out Israel, to attack USA.
It's our policy of preemptive, deliberate invasions of foreign countries and occupying these countries that has jeopardized our safety. This blowback principle is what caused 9/11, and we have to come to realize that if you keep living in this dreamland of saying that they attack us because we're free and prosperous, believe me, we're never going to get
Well, if you think that if we withdraw off the Gulf, if we get our people out of there, there's not going to be any more terrorism, then you're living in the dreamland. You didn't even want to go into Afghanistan to punish those people, did you?
You're wrong, Bill. You're wrong on that. I voted for that. So you be careful on your quotes. I mean, you're
well, in a debate, you said you don't want to be there. You don't want to be in Afghanistan.
Well, they didn't do what we were supposed to. We were supposed to go after Osama bin Laden. We let him go into Pakistan.
We didn't let him go anywhere. He escaped in there. That's war. That's what happens in war.
Know. But what did we do? We went into doing exactly what Bush said he wouldn't do, into nation building.
All right, let me do I got one more question. We're in Afghanistan now trying to have that country stem back the Taliban tide. Are we doing the wrong thing there?
Right now, we're doing the wrong thing because we didn't do what he was authorized to do. The president ignored going after bin Laden, and we don't need to be in nation building. We need to defend this country and defend our national security, and our national security interests are not served by the policy that we're following in the Middle East. It's undermining our national security.
All right, so we got it.
Have to come to realize it.
We got it, and we appreciate the lively debate. Thanks for appearing tonight. Next on the rundown, will Americans...
That was an old one. From 2007. Alright, let me get this in the chat. And I will not play that today, but I will try and get permission from these guys to actually play this next time. Make that. And put that in there. Okay, now I got it bookmarked. So, I can check that for next week, Anon. That like that. Alright. Got me some coffee. Yay! Jules put a link in the chat. GM, Ford, and others want to make working on your car, your own car, illegal. Is that so? Says who? Blah, blah, blah. One of the inherent rights of owning a vehicle is the ability to get on one's backside. A wrench in one hand and a grease rag in the other. And just tinker to your little heart's desire. Since the vehicle was invented, it has been the most important facet within the community of gearheads. General Motors, the same company responsible for 87 deaths related to faulty ignition switches, FYI, for your information, wants to take that right away from you, citing safety and security issues, along with a few other big names. It is called the DMCA, Digital Millennium Copyright Act. Copyright? What does that to do with fixing your own car, right? It's been around since 2000 and started as anti-internet privacy legislation. But automakers want to use it to try and make working on your own car illegal. The general premise is that unlike cars of the past, today's vehicles are so advanced and use such a large amount of software and coding in their general makeup, altering said code could be dangerous and possibly even malicious. Listing the vehicle as a mobile computing device, the law would hypothetically protect automakers from pesky owners looking to alter any sort of technology in the vehicle that relates to the onboard computer. Flashing your ECU would be a big no-no, which could also lead to all sorts of problems for aftermarket shops. What GM and even tractor companies like John Deere argues is that you as an owner don't actually own your car. Rather, you're sort of just borrowing it for an extended amount of time and paying for the rights to use the technology. If it sounds ridiculous, it is, but it gets even more ludicrous. According to the Electric Frontier Foundation, John Deere argued that letting people modify car computer systems will result in them pirating music through the onboard entertainment system. Okay. DMCA does give a little bit of leeway though. While the Act could hypothetically lock customer out of key safety features, it would still allow owners the ability to repair other areas of the vehicle's onboard computers as they see fit. It's a slim compromise, but one that may be more closely based in reality. As it currently sits, there are 13 large automakers on the list, supporting the DMCA. Ironically, one of the brands that relies most on technology in its vehicles, Tesla Motors, is not in support of the DMCA, while other American companies like GM, Ford and Chrysler all agree that working on your own vehicle should be punishable by law. Interesting. Yep. There's pictures of car beneath all of that. Pictures of nice cars, I mean. Yeah. Alright. That was from the chat room. Any other interesting links you guys posted? No? Okay. Then we can continue where we... yeah, mobile computing device, right, Jules? Yeah. Some people, continuing, seeing the disaster caused by the two-party system, blame extremism for the negative effects of government. They surmise that if people would only support a form of coercive control somewhere in between the far left and the far right, things would improve. Such people claim to be independent, open-minded and moderate, but in reality are merely general advocates of oppression instead of being advocates of a particular flavor of oppression. The left and right are merely two masks which the one ruling class wears, and making a new mask, which is a compromise between the other two, will have no effect whatsoever upon the nature of the beast or the destruction it causes. Taking a position halfway between left-wing tyranny and right-wing tyranny does not result in freedom, it results in bipartisan tyranny. Among those who vote Democrat or Republican, or any other party, no one recognizes the underlying problem. As a result, no one ever gets any closer to a solution. Yeah, that's gonna take a little while, Dan. We'll probably need like 3 or 4 more weeks to finish this. And then maybe we go back to mythology. They remain slaves because their thoughts on discussions are limited to the pointless questions of who should be the master. They never consider, and dare not allow themselves to consider, the possibility that they should have no master at all. Like for instance, Dan, how many of the logical fallacies I taught you do you actually remember? Right? Could you type a few in the chat room? Ad baculum, remember that one? I think it's time we do a recap of all of the 42. As a result, they focus entirely on political action of one kind or another, but the foundation of all political action is the belief in authority. Ad veracundium, remember that one? Talking about authority, right? Which is the problem itself, so the efforts of statists are and always will be doomed to fail. Unfortunately, this is also true of the less mainstream, supposedly more pro-freedom political movement, including constitutionalists, the Libertarian Party and others. As long as they think and act within the confines of the government game, their efforts are not only completely incapable of solving the problem, but actually aggravate the problem by inadvertently legitimizing the system of domination and subjugation which wears the label of government. Yay, we made it to the next heading. Even most people who claim to love liberty and to believe in unalienable rights allow the superstition of authority to drastically limit their effectiveness. Yes. Hopper puts it again in the chat. And I don't know why you do that, Hopper. Everybody can read it. It's on top of the chat. You have some comment about that? Please do so. I already talked about it in the beginning. I may as well repeat that. If you're talking to other people in the chat, you should refrain from attacking chatters. Alright, that's called attacking the person. Ad hominem. Right, it's a logical fallacy. Please refrain from using logical fallacies, right? However, if your ideas or your arguments or that what you say gets attacked, don't confuse that with an attack on the person. Right? Some people are so attached to their ideas or their convictions that when somebody gives an argument against it, they themselves feel attacked. Right? So, but there's a difference between attacking ideas and persons. Right? This should be for everybody, you know. Don't identify yourself with your thinking. The rules of the game is the next heading. Yeah. All right, Hopper. Even most people who claim to love liberty and to believe in unalienable rights allow the superstition of authority to drastically limit their effectiveness. Most of what such people do, in one way or another, consists of asking tyrants to change their laws. Whether activists campaign for or against a particular candidate or lobby for or against a particular piece of legislation, they are merely reinforcing the assumption that obedience to authority is a moral imperative. Yeah. When activists try to convince politicians to decrease taxes or repeal some law, those activists are implicitly admitting that they need permission from their masters in order to be free. And the man who runs for office, promising to fight for the people, is also implying that it is up to those in government to decide what the peasants will be allowed to do. As Daniel Webster put it, there are men in all ages who mean to govern well, but they mean to govern. They promise to be good masters, but they mean to be masters. Activists spend huge amount of time, money and effort begging their masters to change their commands. Many even go out of their way to stress the fact that they are working within the system, and that they are not advocating anything illegal. This shows that, regardless of their displeasure with those in power, they still believe in the myth of authority and will cooperate with legal injustice unless and until they can convince the masters to change the rules, to legalize justice. Right, I don't get that sentence. Blah, blah, blah. While the intended message of dissenters may be that they disapprove of what the masters are doing, the actual message that all political action sends to those in power is, we wish you could change your commands, but we will continue to obey whether you do or not. The truth is, one who seeks to achieve freedom by petitioning those in power to give it to them has already failed, regardless of the response. To beg for the blessing of authority is to accept that the choice is the master's alone to make, which means that the person is already, by definition, a slave. One who begs for lower taxes is implicitly agreeing that it is up to the politicians how much a man may keep of what he has earned. One who begs the politicians not to disarm him is, by doing so, conceding that it is up to the masters whether to let the man be armed or not. In fact, those who lobby for politicians to respect any of the people's unalienable rights do not believe in unalienable rights at all. Yeah. Rights which require government approval are not unalienable, and are not even rights. They are privileges, granted or withheld at the whim of the master. And those who hold positions of power know that they have nothing to fear from the people, who do nothing but pathetically beg for freedom and justice. However loudly the dissenters talk about demanding their rights, the message they actually send is, we agree, master, that it is up to you what we may and may not do. The underlying message can be seen in all sorts of activities mistakenly imagined to be forms of resistance. For example, people often engage in protest in front of government buildings, carrying signs, chanting slogans, sometimes even engaging in violence to express their displeasure with what the masters are doing. However, even such protests, for the most part, do little more than reinforce authoritarianism. Marches just come to my mind again. A little background knowledge about the word marches. The claim is that it is called March because in the month March the Romans would go out again on their conquests, right? They didn't wage war in winter, they waited for March to come and then they started marching. Get it? Marches, sit-ins, protests, and so on are designed to send a message to the masters, the goal being to convince the masters to change their evil ways. But that message still implies that it is up to the masters what the people may do, which becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. When the people feel beholden to an authority, they are beholden to an authority. Those in government derive all of their power from the fact that their subjects imagine them to have power. Right? This is much like, if you've watched SG-1, the Ori, who derive their power from their followers. This is exactly the same as the Ori, if you know what I'm talking about, if you've watched SG-1, Season 10. Right? Next heading, legitimizing oppression. The harder people try to work within any political system to achieve freedom, the more they will reinforce, in their own minds and the minds of anyone watching, that the system is legitimate. Petitioning politicians to change their laws implies that those laws matter and should be obeyed. Right? The laws matter. Nothing better shows the power of the belief in authority than the spectacle of 100 million people begging a few hundred politicians for lower taxes. Yeah. If the people truly understood that the fruits of a man's labor are his own, they would never engage in such lunacy. They would simply stop surrendering their property to the political parasites. Excuse me. They're trained. Yeah, they're trained in. They're trained in desire to have the approval of authority creates in them a mindset not unlike the mindset of a slave. They literally feel bad about keeping their own money and making their own choices without first getting the master's permission to do so. Even when freedom is theirs for the taking, statists continue to grovel at the feet of megalomaniacs, begging for freedom, thus ensuring that they will never be free. The truth is, one cannot believe in authority and be free, because accepting the myth of government is accepting one's own obligation to obey a master, which means accepting one's own enslavement. Yeah, that's probably correct, Dan. Yeah, that's probably correct. He says, appeal to authority is the most common in America. Well, we have it here in the Netherlands as well, probably. The most used logical fallacy. Because, for instance, at 8 o'clock, we have the news here on most channels. Some channels at 7:30 at night, doesn't matter. A lot of the times you will hear things like experts say, or activists believe, or, scientists say. Those are all appeals to authority. Right? Especially the one experts say. We hear that a lot. All they have to do is say that. Experts say. And everybody jumps into line and believes whatever is told to them. They don't know who the expert is. It's a specific fallacy of the unknown authority. If they would give names with those experts, you could actually check those experts, see if what they are talking about actually is in their field of expertise, see if he actually wrote some papers on the subject, see if those papers make any sense at all. Yeah, that would be a contradiction in itself also, Vince. Yeah. Blah, blah. Where were we? Sadly, many people... What's that? That's a cat looking through a microscope. Lol. Funny. Sadly, many people believe that begging the master via political action is all they can do. So, they forever engage in rituals which only legitimize the slave-master relationship, instead of simply disobeying the tyrants. The idea of disobeying authority, breaking the law, and being criminals is more disturbing to them than the idea of being a slave. Those who want a significantly lower level of authoritarian control and coercion are sometimes accused of being anti-government, an allegation most vehemently deny? I don't get this sentence. How do I read that? I'll just read it like it says here. Maybe you can make sense of it. Those who want a significantly lower level of authoritarian control and coercion are sometimes accused of being anti-government, an allegation most vehemently deny, saying that they are not against government per se. An allegation they most vehemently deny, probably should say, but only want a better government. But by their own words they are admitting that they do not believe in true freedom, but still believe in the divine right of politicians and the idea that a ruling class can be a good and legitimate thing. Only someone who still feels an abiding obligation to obey the commands of politicians would want to avoid being labeled anti-government. Since government always consists of aggression and domination, one cannot be truly pro-freedom without being anti-government. The fact that so many activists reject that label shows how deeply ingrained the superstition of authority remains, even in the minds of those who imagine themselves to be ardent advocates of individual liberty. One particularly fascinating phenomenon is worth mentioning here. Outraged by authoritarian injustice, but still unwilling to give up the authority superstition in themselves, many in the growing freedom militia patriot movements continue to seek or claim to have found some legal remedy which will persuade tyrants to leave them in peace. Over the years, one theory after another has surfaced alleging the existence of some secret government form or some legal trick or some official procedure which can free an individual from the control of government. Sadly, this demonstrates only that such people are still doing nothing more than looking for a way to get permission to be free. But the road to true freedom has never been and will never be a new political ritual, a new legal document or argument, or any other form of political action. The only road to true freedom is for the individual to let go of his own attachment to the superstition of authority. Alright, we made it to the next heading, which is called the libertarian contradiction. Perhaps the best illustration of how the belief in authority warps thinking and gets in the way of achieving freedom is the fact that there is a libertarian political party. The heart and soul of libertarianism is the non-aggression principle, the idea that initiating force or fraud against another is always wrong, and that force is justified only if used in defense against aggression. The principle is perfectly sound, but trying to make it a reality via any political process is completely self-contradictory, because government and non-aggression are utterly incompatible. If the organization called government stopped using any threats or violence except to defend against aggressors, It would cease to be government. It would have no right to rule, no right to legislate, no monopoly on protection, and no right to do anything which any other human beings does not have the right to do. Of course, no, not of course. Phew, how did I get that? One excuse for libertarian political activism is the claim that society can transform from its current authoritarian arrangement into a truly free society only if it does so slowly and gradually. However, that has never happened and never will happen, for a very simple reason. Either there is such a thing as authority, or there is not. Either there is a legitimate ruling class with the right to rule everyone, or each individual owns himself and is beholden only to his own conscience. The two are mutually exclusive paradigms. It is impossible for there to be an in-between, because whenever there is a conflict between what authority commands and what one's individual judgment dictates, it is impossible to obey both. One must outrank the other. If authority outranks conscience, then the common folk are all the rightful property of the ruling class, in which case freedom cannot and should not exist. If, on the other hand, conscience outranks authority, then each person owns himself. Yeah. I should probably talk about that word conscience for a minute. It doesn't say consciousness. All right? Those are two different things. Conscience in Dutch would be geweten. Right? That's the past tense of knowing. Right? But that's not what's meant by it. It means a kind of introspection into one's own moral world and deciding whether something is good or bad. Right? That's conscience. That's not the same as consciousness. Consciousness, according to objectivist philosophy anyway, which I'm not sure I agree with yet, is a faculty to be aware of what your senses are giving to you. Alright, I still have trouble with the word consciousness, by the way. But so in Dutch, conscience becomes geweten. Consciousness becomes a totally other word called bewustzijn. Right? The two are a little bit of tied, though, as far as I can see. The term bewustzijn, which means consciousness, has a root in it which ties back to knowing. The wust, that's German. Ich habe es nicht gewusst. Bewusst, gewusst. You hear the etymological tie there, right? It means knowing. Alright, so don't confuse the two terms, conscience and consciousness. They are two totally different things. If, on the other hand, conscience outranks authority, then each person owns himself, and each must always follow his own judgment of right and wrong. Yeah, that's what I said, right? No matter what any self-proclaimed authority or law may command. Right? There cannot be a gradual shift between the two, nor can there be a compromise. Right? So, and in order for you to be able to decide on your own which is right and wrong, you must have an ontology and an epistemology. Most people do, but are unaware of it. I think it's important, so I'll just repeat that again. In order to be able to decide for yourself whether something is good or bad, you must have a view of what reality is, which is ontology, or another word for that is metaphysics. And you must have epistemology, which means how do you know what you know? Right? What is the basis? What do you use as the basis for attaining knowledge? Continuing, there cannot be a gradual shift between the two, nor can there be a compromise. Trying to convert libertarianism into a political movement requires a mangled, perverted hybrid of the two options. The idea that a system of domination, government, can be used to achieve individual freedom. Yeah, those are two opposites, right? Whenever a libertarian lobbies for legislation or runs for office, he is, by his own actions, conceding that authority and man-made law is legitimate. But if one actually believed in the non-aggression principle, he would understand that the commands of politicians, aka laws, cannot trump that principle, and any law that is contrary to the principle is illegitimate. This goes for the idea of unalienable rights as well. If an individual has an inherent right to do something, then by definition he does not need any permission from tyrants to do it. He does not need to lobby for a change in legislation and does not need to try to elect some master who will choose to respect his rights. Anyone who actually believes in the principle of non-aggression, the underlying premise of libertarianism, must be an anarchist, as it is logically impossible to oppose the initiation of violence while supporting any form of government, which is nothing but violence. And libertarians cannot be constitutionalists, as the Constitution quite plainly, in Article 1, Section 8, claims to bestow upon some people the right to initiate violence via taxation and regulation, among other things. The principle of libertarianism logically rules out all government, even a constitutional republic. Anyone who tries to describe a government which commits no acts of aggression will describe at best a private security company. Nonetheless, so many people have been so thoroughly trained into the authoritarian mindset that even when they can see the obvious moral superiority of living by the non-aggression principle, they still refuse to give up the absurd notion that the right to rule can be used as a tool for freedom and justice. There is a fundamental difference between arguing about what the master should do, which is what all politics consists of, and declaring that the master has no right to rule at all. Right, so if you heard me talk in the first hour, you heard me use the word ethics, from which comes politics. Because politics is poly-ethics, right? Ethics for more people, for groups of people. All right, that's politics. The word, that is, not what's really going on. To be a libertarian candidate is to try to do both of these conflicting things. It obviously legitimizes the office the candidate seeks to hold. And by the way, about what I just said, if you look at politics stemming from ethics, you should realize that because ethics stems from your ontology and your epistemology, politics should also be derived from those conclusions that you made. in the first two. Even while the candidate is claiming to believe in the principles of non-aggression and self-ownership, which completely rule out the possibility of any legitimate public office. In short, if the goal is individual freedom, political action is not only worthless, it is hugely counterproductive, because the main thing it accomplishes is to legitimize the ruling class's power. The only way to achieve freedom, that's correct then, vehemently denied, is heftig ontkennen, or in another way, could be used in a sentence, ontkende heftig. The only way to achieve freedom is to first achieve mental freedom, by realizing that no one has the right to rule another, which means that government is never legitimate. It is never moral, it's never even real. Those who have not yet realized that and continue to try to petition the system to make them free are playing right into the hands of the tyrants. Even petitioning for lower levels of taxation or government spending, or asking for things to be legalized or deregulated, or begging for other reductions in government control over people, still do nothing to address the real problem. And, in fact, add to the real problem by unwittingly repeating and reinforcing the idea that if the people want freedom, they need to have freedom legalized. Political action, by its very nature, always empowers the ruling class and disempowers the people. If enough people recognize and let go of the authority myth, there is no need for any election, any political action, or any revolution. Yeah, I would call it a revolution if people actually recognize the authority myth. It would be a revolution in thinking, right? If the people did not imagine themselves to have an obligation to obey the politicians would literally be ignored into irrelevance. In fact, the belief in democracy dramatically reduces the ability of the people to resist tyranny by limiting the ways in which they resist it. For example, if 49% of the population wanted lower levels of taxation but maintained their belief in authority, they could accomplish exactly nothing via democracy. On the other hand, if even 10% of the people wanted no taxation at all and had escaped the myth of authority, including the democratic kind, they could achieve their goal easily by simple non-compliance. Using the US as an example, if 20 million people, less than 10% of the American taxpayers, openly refused to cooperate with the attempts by the IRS to extort them, the ruling class would be powerless to do anything about it. And the infamous Internal Revenue Service, along with the massive extortion racket it administers, would grind to a halt. It would be utterly impossible for 100,000 IRS employees to continually rob millions of Americans who felt no obligation to pay. In fact, it would be impossible for any agency to enforce any law which even a fraction of the public could disobey with no feeling of shame or guilt. Brute force alone could not achieve compliance. No, they figured that out a long time ago. That's why they use mind control now. Any large population of people that did not perceive obedience in and of itself to be a virtue and felt no inherent duty to obey the commands of those claiming the right to rule would be utterly impossible to oppress. Wars occur only because people feel obliged to go into battle when authority tells them to. As the saying goes, what if they had a war and nobody came? As long as the people can be duped into perpetually begging for freedom to be legalized, they will be easy to subjugate and control. As long as a person's perceived duty to obey authority outranks his own personal beliefs and individual judgment, his beliefs and opinions are, as a practical matter, irrelevant. Unless and until a freedom advocate is willing to obey the master, to break the law, his supposed love of freedom is a lie and will accomplish nothing. Next heading. Same as the old boss. Many have argued that society without rulers is impossible, because the moment one government collapses and is overthrown, a new government will instantly spring up. In one sense, that is true. If the people continue to adhere to the myth of authority, after any upheaval of a particular regime, they will simply create a new set of masters to replace the old set. But the reason for this is neither the necessity of government nor the basic nature of man. What nearly all freedom fighters fail to realize, as they rail against tyranny and oppression, is that the underlying problem is never the particular people in power. The underlying problem resides in the minds of the people being oppressed. Right? Another way of putting this. The underlying problem resides in the minds of the people being controlled, including the minds of most freedom fighters. As long as the people accept the myth of authority, even open revolution will, in the long run, do nothing to reduce the oppression. When one group of controllers and exploiters falls, the people will simply set up another. Though few of those who wave their flags on Independence Day may realize it, the level of oppression under King George III, just before the American Revolution, was trivial compared to the current levels of taxation, regulation, and other authoritarian intrusion, coercion, and harassment which routinely occur in the United States today. Yeah. It is easy for people to see specific injustices committed in the name of a particular regime, but far more difficult for those same people to recognize that the root cause of such injustices is the belief system of the general public. History books are full of examples of long, bloody reigns of tyrants, followed at last by bloody revolution, followed by the anointing of a new tyrant. The type of tyrant may change: a monarch replaced by a communist regime, a right-wing tyrant replaced by a left-wing tyrant, an oppressive theocracy replaced by an oppressive populist regime, and so on. But as long as the belief in authority remains, so will oppression. Alright, it's 58. Which means my outro will be kicking in. So I'm gonna thank the people in the chat, like One Anon, Hans, Vince, Jules, Joe Friday, how you doing, buddy? Hopper and Dan and Del appeared in the chat today. Thanks for chatting and talking to other people. I would say see you guys next week. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings.
I think a new world order is emerging.
An inside job? How dare you? How dare you?
To create, so to say, mass-produced models of human beings arranged in some kind of a scientific caste system.